women of the colonial era. And it's sort of a two-part lead up to next year's celebration of the Declaration of Independence. So this year we're focusing heavily on colonial women, and of course I always try to find the interesting ones because normal is kind of boring. So today we will present some of the notable colonial women in our history. Interestingly enough, many of us never learned about them in school, and I don't know whether they're teaching any of it now. We'll have to ask our students. So life in colonial America varied. It depended on your social class, your individual circumstances, where you were living. Most people were farmers. They spent long days working in the fields and caring for livestock. Communication was limited to word of mouth and letters. The weather was terrible. There were constant skirmishes with the Native Americans, and that made life tense, and illness was prevalent. And so these were not easy times. So towns grew up, they survived basically by taking care of themselves. Society was divided into classes, and at the top were the wealthy landowners, at the bottom were the slaves and the indentured servants who had pretty much no rights. Many of the colonies were founded on religious principles. We had the Pilgrims who went to Plymouth, the Puritans who went to Massachusetts, the Quakers to Pennsylvania, and Roger Williams who opened up Rhode Island to everybody. So religion played a predominant role in colonial life. Governance was local. There was very little interference from England, and community meetings, church gatherings, and other celebrations were the ways that the community came together and had socialized. One of the things that we know for a fact is that colonial women were homemakers. Now, why do we know that for a fact? Because women are always the homemakers, right? Our primary duties were domestic. We took care of the kids, we took care of the animals, we took care of all the things the men couldn't take care of. We also made goods that we used and sold, like textiles, clothing, candles, soap. All of those things were within our purview. We cared for the sick and the healthy. And yet, we were considered less than. We had very few legal rights. We couldn't own property, we couldn't sign contracts, we couldn't work outside of the home, and we were pretty much, our identity was tied to that of our fathers or our husbands. And while formal education was uncommon for women, girls were generally taught to read and write and do basic arithmetic, of course, by their mothers at home. We couldn't vote, we couldn't own property, there were a lot of things that we couldn't do. We couldn't complain about domestic abuse. And if we were argumentative or somehow stepped out of line, whatever that meant, we were subject to public humiliation, which included the stocks and hair shaving. So, childbirth, of course, was very dangerous for women. Infant and maternal death was very, very high. It was a very dangerous time. And we had no control over our bodies, ourselves, or anything else. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Marriage was looked at as a duty. You had to get married. How else were you going to survive if you didn't have a husband and a family? And domestic abuse was not at all uncommon. We were expected to be silent, chaste, and more or less confined to the household, speaking only when spoken to, and obeying our husbands and fathers. And isn't that boring? All right, so women, in particular widows or women who were unmarried, could work. Now, the most common work, if you will, for women was midwifery. Women were the midwives, they were the carers of the sick, they were usually herbalists, they were the people that you went to when you needed something. And that was because the men wanted nothing whatsoever to do with down there. At least not that part down there. So, the Native American women, many of them held very powerful positions in their tribes. That balance was upset when the settlers started to arrive and a different kind of culture took over. So today we're going to meet these not your mother's colonial dames, some of the women who defied traditional roles and stepped outside the bounds and left us with these wonderful stories and these wonderful traditions. Now the problem is, each and every one of these characters, there are so many stories. Books have been written, movies have been made about these characters, these women. And we don't really know what's true because so much of it is passed down through lore, which is why some of these stories might be a bit confusing, but we'll try to explain all of that. We're going to start with Pocahontas. Pocahontas, her story was written by others, but what you're going to hear today comes from a book that was published in 2007 called The True Story of Pocahontas, The Other Side of History by Dr. Linwood Little Bear Costello and Angela Daniel Silverstar, based on the sacred oral history of Pocahontas' Mattapony tribe. So you may hear some inconsistencies, some differences to the stories that you may have been told. So let's listen to Pocahontas' story.
My name is Matoaka. I was the last child of Chief Powhatan and his first wife, Pocahontas, who died giving birth to me. My father was devastated by her death and found joy in me and often called me Pocahontas, which meant laughing and joyous one, as I reminded him of my mother, his beloved wife. When the English arrived, the Powhatan people welcomed them. We desired to become friends and trade with the settlers. Although Captain John Smith tells a different story, he was actually welcomed as another chief. And by welcoming him, by extension, we welcomed all of the English to the Powhatan nation. To cement this new alliance, my father sent food to Jamestown during the winter of 1608. Doing so was the Powhatan way. As leaders acted for the good of the whole tribe, it was during these visits to the fort that I became known to the English as a symbol of peace. Over time, relations between the Powhatan and the English began to deteriorate as the settlers became more aggressive in demanding food that we could not provide. As relations continued to worsen between the two people, I had my coming of age ceremony, symbolizing my eligibility for courtship and marriage. The ceremony itself was performed discreetly and more secretly than usual because of the persistent rumors that the English planned to kidnap me. As a ceremony, a powwow was held in celebration and thanksgiving, and a courtship dance allowed single male warriors to search for a mate. It was then that I met colonial. After a courtship period, we married. Shortly after giving birth to my son, the long-suspected English plan to kidnap me was carried out. Before Captain Argall sailed off with me, he had my husband killed. Luckily, our son was with another woman from the tribe. I was taken to Jamestown, and my father immediately met the demand to return English prisoners and weapons to Jamestown to pay my ransom, but I was not returned, and my father fell into a deep depression. I too became deeply depressed, but submitted to the will of my captors. Being taken into captivity was not foreign, as it took place between tribes as well, but I wanted to be cooperative for the good of my people and as a means of survival. My captors insisted my father did not love me, and I suffered a nervous breakdown, and then the English asked that my sister be sent to care for me. I confided in her that I had been raped and that I might be pregnant. I was sent away, where I gave birth to my son, Thomas. Feeling that I had no choice, I converted to Christianity and was renamed Rebecca. I married John Rolfe, the man who introduced tobacco planting to the colony. With the blessing of my father, it was the first recorded marriage between a Native American and an English settler. In 1616, John and I, along with several Powhatan representatives, were sent to England to raise interest in Jamestown. I was touted as a civilized Native American and was introduced to King James I and Queen Anne. Following our successful tour, we were ready to return to Virginia. While on the ship, John and I dined with Captain Argyle, but shortly after I became very ill and began to convulse, and I passed away. I was 21. I never returned home.
There are many stories about Pocahontas and her life. John Rolfe, whom she married, truly loved her. And whether or not he is considered to be the father of her son Thomas. So there, again, a little bit of leeway in the story. We don't exactly know what happened, but that's part of the intrigue of the 17th century. She was buried in England, taken back to England and buried there. and her grave is marked, but they're not sure that it's the actual grave. So if you are interested in learning more about her, there is a lot of information. Dina was to play her. Dina is her descendant. So she had she says, I'll wear my costume next time I come. I said, you do that. So anyway, the marriage did create a temporary peace, but we all know that the temporary pieces didn't really last very long, although Thomas Rolfe was very influential in colonial Virginia in carrying that out. And she has many descendants through the two sons. And now we'll move from Jamestown to, of course, the Plymouth folks. So the Pilgrims left the Church of England and called themselves Pilgrims and traveled to the New World for religious freedom. We all know that. Has anybody ever been on the replica of the Mayflower?
Yes.
Okay. So, I didn't go. I was there many, many years ago, and for some reason, we didn't go on it. But let me tell you this. It was about 106 feet long and 25 feet wide, which is about the length of a basketball court, not the arena, the court, and about half the width. 102 people were on board. They stayed on the same level as the guns. They had carved out a few feet of private space for themselves with boards to create some sort of privacy. There were no windows, there were no latrines. It was pretty ghastly, and there were 102 of them there for 66 days. So by the time they got anywhere, I'm sure they were happy to breathe some fresh air. Anyway, bless you, bless you. Let's meet one of the intrepid survivors of that journey, Priscilla Mullins Alden.
My name is Priscilla Mullins, and I want to tell you a love story. It's no ordinary love story, though, or is it? When I was 15, I traveled to the New World with my parents and my brother on the Mayflower. It was while on board that I met John Alden and Miles Standish. John Alden was not a separatist, but a copper hired by the London merchants who financed the expedition. We arrived in Plymouth, and he decided to remain with us and not to return to London with the Mayflower. Miles Standish was hired by the Pilgrims as a military advisor for their voyage and the establishment of the Plymouth colony. He was elected as the first commander of the Plymouth colony militia in February 1621 and held this position for the rest of his life. My family died during the terrible first winter of the Plymouth colony, and I became an orphan and one of the few single women in the colony. So what about the love story I promised you? Well, you decide for yourself. The Courtship of Miles Standish is a narrative poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, published in 1858. It's a humorous and romantic tale set in early days of Plymouth colony, and it's loosely based on historical figures and events involving a love triangle. Longfellow portrays Standish as a brave but somewhat gruff and awkward military leader. He's a skilled fighter but lacks confidence in matters of love. John Alden becomes a thoughtful and eloquent young man who serves as Standish's friend and advisor. Finally, there is me, the beautiful and witty young woman who is the object of both men's affection. In the poem, Standish, believing himself too busy and too important for courtship, asks John to propose to me on his behalf. John, who is secretly in love with me, reluctantly agrees. However, when he delivers Standish's proposal, I famously respond with, "Why don't you speak for yourself, John?" The poem describes a period of awkwardness and tension between the three. Eventually, Standish, consumed by jealousy and anger, confronts Alden. But before a duel can take place, news arrives of an Indian uprising. Standish's military skills are needed, and he rides off to the battle. When Standish returns victorious, he finds John and I engaged. He accepts the situation with grace, and the poem ends with our wedding. Sadly, there is no evidence of a triangle of love with Miles Standish as portrayed in the poem. The flirtatiously romantic question, "Why don't you speak for yourself, John?" was meant to capture the spirit of personal choice and romance. Well, I won't confirm or deny speculation. At the time, men and women likely married out of companionship and necessity. After all, there weren't that many single women. Nevertheless, John and I went on to have 11 children and helped settle Duxbury, Massachusetts. In addition to signing the Mayflower Compact, John became a prominent figure in colonial Massachusetts, and our homestead is now a historic site. We are buried in the nearby Miles Standish Burial Ground.
Thank you. John Alden was the longest survivor of the original Mayflower group, and he and Priscilla are responsible for more descendants, according to the Mayflower Society, than any other original passenger on the Mayflower. So that's a testament to something. Okay. Next, we're going to move to the Puritan period. The Puritans were not the same as the Pilgrims. They tried to fix the Church of England from the inside. They felt that it was too fancy, too much like the Catholic Church. The Church of Rome, I should say, the Holy Church of Rome, which is why they broke with it. And they traveled to the New World, again, for religious freedom. They were established as a Massachusetts Bay company, not a colony, so that they could use Puritan law as the law of the land and not the King of England. So they had kind of a symbiotic relationship with the king. Nevertheless, we're going to meet three really interesting women from the Puritan era. They all knew each other because it was a small community. We're going to start with Anne Bradstreet. Anne Bradstreet was remarkable in American literature. She received a good education in England for a woman at that time and is recognized as the first published female poet in the American colonies. Her poems explored themes of family, faith, and her love for her husband, her children, her faith, and nature. So let's meet the lovely Anne Bradstreet.
Well, this is my story. Although I did not attend school, I received an excellent education from my father. He devoured his books from his well-stocked library, and I certainly benefited from the Elizabethan tradition that valued female education. I married Simon Bradstreet, and we emigrated to the New World along with my parents. Well, I was not happy to exchange the comforts of my aristocratic life in an earl's manor house for the privation of the New World and the New England wilderness. However, I dutifully joined my father and my family, and both of our families really, on the Puritan errand into the wilderness. And after a difficult 3-month crossing, our ship, the Arabella, finally docked in Massachusetts at Salem on the 20th of July, 1630. Distressed by sickness, scarcity of food, attacks by the Native Americans who originally occupied the land, and the primitive living conditions of the New England outpost, I had to admit my heart rose in protest against the New World and the new manners. Reluctantly, I submitted to and accepted the Puritan life and joined the church at Boston. But nevertheless, I remained ambivalent about the issues of salvation and redemption for most of my life. And although I had 8 children and my domestic responsibilities were extremely demanding, I found time to write poetry. Late at night, with my children tucked in bed and my husband away at business, I composed poems by candlelight, letting my thoughts from the day tumble out and memorizing each line of the poems. And I released my thoughts into scraps of scarce parchment. I'd like to read to you 2 of my favorite poems. The first one is to my dear and loving husband. If ever 2 were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife than thee, if ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than the whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east does hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such, I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live in love, so let us persevere, that when we live no more, we may live ever. The second poem is to my dear children. This book, by any yet unread, I leave for you when I am dead. That being gone, here you may find what was your living mother's mind. Make use of what I leave in love, and God shall bless you from above. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne Bradstreet is still studied today. Her poems are still, as you can see, touch your heart. They're still relevant today. And we think she also gave us a very good input into what life was like, what was going on, and the viewpoint of women in religion. And I believe that poem, one of her poems at least, was written right before she was about to give birth, because as I mentioned, women often died in childbirth, and she wanted her children to know her. And so she wanted to leave something behind to let her, in case she did not survive, how much she loved them. Thank you, that was beautiful. Appreciate that, thank you. We're gonna meet another Anne. This is an Anne who was famous in another way. She was kind of a radical. She's very interesting. Many books have been written about Anne Hutchinson and many movie portrayals. Anne Hutchinson was also a Puritan who traveled to England with her family, but she was the kind of the one who wanted to make the move. And hang on a second, here we go. She was a religious reformer, and she challenged Puritan leadership in Massachusetts by holding Bible study meetings in her own home, and she questioned the rigid doctrine of the Puritan faith. And the powers that be did not like that. The clergy wanted absolute control over all of the information. It came from the clergy, and that was it. What the clergy told you was true. And she got herself into a little trouble, as we will hear from Alice Mugler and Anne Hutchinson.
I was born in 1591 in Lincolnshire, England. My father, Francis Marbury, was a Puritan minister who was tried for heresy by the church after making repeated critical comments and was jailed. After my father's death, I married my childhood friend, cloth merchant William Hutchison, and began to work in our town of Alfred as a midwife and an herbalist. This was about the time I started teaching Bible sessions in my home with other women. At my insistence, William and I became followers of Puritan minister John Cotton, who preached that mercy is preordained by God, but damnation is determined by earthly behavior. The ascent of King Charles I in 1626 led to the persecution of certain Protestant sects by the Anglican Church of England. Puritans began fleeing in large numbers beginning in 1630. John Cotton was questioned by the church over concerns that his preaching was causing dissent, and immediately went into hiding before fleeing to Boston a short time later. While reading the Bible one day, I received a revelation from God that my family should follow John Cotton to Boston. In the meantime, believing Massachusetts was in opposition to the king, British authorities closed the borders. Immigrants were prohibited from leaving under threat of prosecution. My family, including our 10 children, was able to dodge British authorities and depart for Boston. It was during my involvement with a healing group that I developed the religious philosophy that became the focus of my preaching. You see, I believed that heaven was attainable to anyone who worshiped God directly through a personal connection. I also believed that behavior, and therefore sin, did not affect whether someone went to heaven, beliefs that were in direct violation of the Puritan doctrine. I expanded on my ideas in sermons, and men and women flocked to our home to listen to me. I was holding 2 meetings a week with as many as 80 people at each meeting. It was no surprise that I soon began receiving negative attention from the Puritan leadership who believed that only men could preach and thought my ideas were dangerous. Those who rose up in opposition to me were Governor Winthrop and John Cotton, both fearing I was becoming a separatist. They went so far as to send female spies to my sermons and forbade meetings in my home. Several months into my 11th pregnancy, I was called to appear before the general court with Winthrop presiding and Cotton testifying against me. For 2 days, I held my own with a group of men who challenged my biblical prowess, but my final argument sealed my fate. It was a lengthy statement that included an account of me speaking directly with God, that concluded with a prophecy on the ruin of the court and the colony in retribution for their persecution of me. Seeing this as a challenge to their authority, I was proclaimed a heretic and my family banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. At the urging of Roger Williams, we and 30 other families established Portsmouth in the Rhode Island Territory.
That's not the end of her story. There's a very good book about her called American Jezebel. She was banished, and then after her husband died, John Winthrop just could not get over her. He took a personal affront to her, and he went to her in Rhode Island and said, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to take over Rhode Island. You have to go again. So she and a small group of her family members moved to New York. They moved to Long Island. It's called Ann's Neck, Ann Heck's Neck. I don't know if you've ever heard of her or not.
Well, there's a parkway named the Hutchinson
Yes, and that's it.
Parkway.
And it's named for
Is it named after her?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, there you go.
And so she took her family, and they had a farm. She bought the land. They built a farm, and they lived a little bit on a ridge. And one day, some Indians and Native Americans came by. She knew them. They were known to her. They took water from her trough. And they said hello, and they went on their way. And a little while later, they see smoke coming up, and her son runs out to see what's going on, runs back, and he says the Indians, or the Native Americans, are burning the town. They're burning the farms, and they're killing the farmers. And at that moment, they all came over the hill, and with tomahawks, they bludgeoned Ann Hutchinson and her family to death, along with several others. She had a daughter, a young daughter, who was a few years old, who'd been off picking berries. And as the Native Americans were leaving, they recognized her, and they took her with them and raised her for several years in their village before she returned to life. So this is a woman who had a fascinating story. There's a lot about her. I think she's one of the most interesting colonial women I never heard of. Have you heard of her?
Yeah.
See? Anybody else learn about her in school? I certainly did, yeah. Well, you're the beneficiary of all of us who've been hollering and yelling and saying, there were women around back then. Great, thank you. All right, so our final Puritan in this little triad is interesting for a completely different reason. Mary Dyer and Anne Bradstreet and Anne Hutchinson were known to each other, but Mary Dyer and Anne Hutchinson were very good friends. They were known for challenging religious and societal norms, and their stories are deeply connected through their defiance of Puritan orthodoxy and their roles in shaping religious freedom in America. So let's meet Mary Dyer.
I came with my husband William to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1633. We were following the other Puritans to start a new life in the New World. It was there that I met Anne Hutchinson, who preached that God spoke directly to individuals rather than through the clergy. We became involved in what was called the antinomian heresy, where we worked to organize groups of men and women to study the Bible, a violation of the theocratic law of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1637, I gave birth to a deformed, stillborn baby, which was buried privately with the help of Anne Hutchinson and John Cotton. After Anne and I were banished from Massachusetts, the authorities learned of the monstrous birth, and Governor Winthrop had it exhumed before a large crowd. He described it thus: It was of ordinary bigness. It had a face but no head, and the ears stood upon the shoulders and were like an ape's. It had no forehead, but over the eyes 4 horns, hard and sharp. And I will say no more. Winthrop sent descriptions to numerous correspondents, including those in England, calling it evidence of the heresies and errors of Antonin Menem, however you say it. After our banishment from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, moving to Rhode Island, my husband and I traveled to England with Roger Williams. It was there that I first heard the preaching of George Fox, founder of the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers. His preaching was in agreement with the ideas Anne Hutchinson and I held years earlier, and I eventually became a Quaker and a preacher in my own right. After returning to Rhode Island, I traveled to Boston to protest the new law banning Quakers. I was arrested and expelled from the colony. I returned again to Massachusetts to visit 2 Quaker friends who had been arrested. I was then arrested and permanently banished from the colony. I traveled to Massachusetts a 3rd time with a group of Quakers to publicly defy the law and was again arrested and sentenced to death. After a short trial, 2 Quakers were hanged. But because my husband was a friend of Governor Winthrop, he secured a last-minute reprieve against my wishes, for I refused to repent and disavow my Quaker faith. My conscience led me to return to Massachusetts in 1660 to again defy the anti-Quaker law. Despite the pleas of my husband and family, I again refused to repent and was again convicted and sentenced to death the following day. I was prepared to be hung for the crime of being a Quaker in Massachusetts and spoke these final words. Nay, I came to keep blood guiltness from you, desiring you to repeal the unrighteous and unjust law made against the innocent servants of the Lord. Nay, man, I am not now to repent.
Ann Dyer's baby, by the way, modern science says was probably encephalic, born without a skull, and had spina bifida. And there's a very lengthy description, and it was published all over the world because Winthrop wanted to punish these people. He also, when he found out Anne Hutchinson was dead, was grateful. He said she got what was coming to her, just as when Ann Dyer hung, they were let her hang and show the rest of the world that she's wrong. So these punishments were very visible, and that was part of why they were done. She is one of 4. They were called the Quaker Martyrs. They were executed on Boston Common, and they were the last. Her hanging really upset people. They were very unhappy about it, and it led to the eventual acceptance, if you will, of the Quaker faith. And there is a bronze statue of her by the Quaker sculptor Sylvia Shaw Judson that stands in front of the Massachusetts State House. Now, we're going to meet the really wild ladies of the colonial era. We've met the nice ones. Well, at least they were quiet. Their sting was a little less obvious. Now we're getting into the people who were really in your face. The Salem witch trials were a series of witchcraft accusations, trials, and executions that took place in only one year, 1692 to 1693. They became one of the darkest chapters in American colonial history, fueled by mass hysteria, religious extremism, and social tension. At the center were a core group of accusers, all girls, young women ranging in age from 9 to 20, who screamed, writhed, barked, and displayed other horrifying symptoms they claimed were signs of satanic possession. Often referred to as the afflicted girls, they included members of prominent families as well as servants. Their bizarre behaviors, of course, were caused by the people they accused. So don't look at me funny. Or her, she's more the age range. So let us, first of all, you're not quite yet. You're going to be introduced by the really flaming tart of all of this, the infamous Abigail Williams, whom we all, those of you who are familiar with the Crucible, here she is. And don't look at her, for sure.
Most of you know that Abigail Williams brought to life in Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. Abigail is the villain in the story as she tells lies and manipulates her friends and the entire village. Miller describes Abigail as 17 with a remarkable capacity for disassembly, who covets Elizabeth Proctor's husband John and tries to get Elizabeth killed in the Salem witch trials so she can be with him. The play's Abigail takes on the almost biblical characteristics of a Jezebel figure, driven only by sexual desire and a lust for power. It is true that at a time, ministers and male adults were God's earthly representatives, their authority derived from on high. It is also true that, as an orphan, I was barely above a slave. But during the trials, in which we accusers are allowed to act as though we have a direct connection to God, our accusations empowered us. But Miller's Abigail is pure evil and threatens to kill any of the girls in Salem who would not follow her lead. Hear these words from the Crucible. Let either of you breathe a word or the edge of a word about things, and I will come to you in the black of some terrible night, and I will bring a pointy reckoning that will shudder you. And you know I can do it. I saw Indians smash my dear parents' heads on the pillow next to mine. And I have seen some reddish work done at night, and I can make you wish you had never seen the sun go down. Anyway, how was I supposed to know that my accusations, along with those of my cousin Betty Paris and other girls, would lead to mass hysteria that resulted in the execution by hanging of 20 people? One man was pressed to death with heavy stones, and the imprisonment of many more. All they had to do to save themselves was confess to being a witch. Here's how it started. In early 1692, Betty and I began experiencing strange fits, including screaming, contorting, and seeing spirits. The local doctor, unable to find a medical cause, suggested witchcraft as an explanation. So under pressure, the other girls and I accused 3 women of witchcraft. Tituba, a mere slave, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a worthless old woman. Okay, so I had headaches and sometimes made weird gestures, but I did see spirits. And it's true that I made legal complaints and testified in 41 cases. Some speculate that because Puritan society was strict and children had little freedom, the trials gave me attention and power. Others thought that I accused people I disliked or who had wronged my family. It is so possible that the fear of witchcraft combined with suggestibility may have led to me genuinely believing that the vision I described were real. Unfortunately, no one will ever know what happened to me because after the trials, I completely disappeared. That's right, no one knows what happened to me, and no one ever will.
Thank you. The perfect role, once again. In reality, Abigail Williams was an 11-year-old girl, and it's doubtful that she knew anything about the things that annoyed the character in The Crucible. That play, by the way, is based on the witch trials. and it does take some of its story from that. But the character of Abigail in the play is a little bit blown out of proportion in order to create some dramatic tension and allow that to come to the front. What happened as a result of the witch trials was the Puritan faith basically died off. They were seen as just idiots. I'm sure I could have said that nicer, but people were like, what is the matter with you people? We put up with you all this long, and no. And it was the beginning of the end for the faith as we know it. But it also changed jurisprudence in our country, because they were allowed to say the spirit. There was no evidence. It was all spectral. It was all contrived. It was mass hysteria. So from that, we have many, many laws of evidence. The right of a person to be considered innocent until proven guilty, and more rights in a trial. We'll hear a little bit more about that, because we want to understand that these trials became a way for us to employ critical thinking and skepticism and be more aware. And nobody is more in agreement with that than our next guest, Bridget Bishop. Oh dear. Don't look at her either. Really.
A witch am I? I'm nothing more than an assertive woman who defied the traditional roles of women in 17th century Salem. I was a hero, always true to myself. I was simply a tenacious and thrice married matron, a victim of domestic abuse, debt, and social discord. Because I was different and misunderstood, I was feared, and that made me an easy target for witchcraft conviction. Unlike other women in Salem Village, I was bold. I wore a black cap, black hat, and a red paragon bodice. My fashions were independent, and my attitude even more so. You bite me, and I will bite you back, although that's enough to get you hanged. In 1680, I was charged and cleared of witchcraft after being accused of using black magic to murder a neighbor and for taking part in the witches' Sabbath. Although I maintained a clear record until 1692, Salem was always suspicious of me. When the accusations were made, I was subjected to an examination by 9 local women. They were searching for abnormal aspects such as a mole or a wart, a witch's teat, or witch's mark, indicating a suckled witch's servant. Witches' marks were anything from a skin tag to an insensitive patch of skin. They decided that I did in fact have a witch's teat, disguised as a third nipple. Yet by the second examination, the nipple had disappeared. They also found an excess of flesh near the anus, a witch's teat, indubitably. A more likely culprit, the humble hemorrhoid. The examination was completely degrading. I was stripped and searched, debasing my body and treating it like an exhibition of evil. I was disgraced and humiliated. At the time of my trial, I was charged with 5 counts of witchcraft for bewitching a pig, making puppets from rags and hog's bristles with headless pins stuck through them, suffocating Richard Corman while he slept by appearing in my red paragon bodice, laying upon his breast or body, and so oppressed him that he could not speak or stir. Why didn't his wife wake up? Corman's actual condition? Probably a dream, and a spicy one at that. There was the accusation that I once brought to the dye house sundry pieces of lace, shapes and dimensions entirely outside of the male shopkeeper's conception of what could be needed in the wardrobe. These items were, a witness declared, snare and sign of the devil. The most outrageous allegation that I had was that I had a monkey lackey, my familiar, or satanic minion, that I unleashed to frighten the neighbors. My trial took all of one day. The proof unsubstantiated, spectral evidence, or tittle-tattle. I was examined yet was allowed no counsel. I was refused a defense. My death warrant was released on June 10th, 1692. Accused of witchcraft against Abigail Williams, for one, I was sentenced to hang by the neck until I shall be dead. The bodies of the girls were, by allegation, hurt, afflicted, pined, consumed, wasted, and tormented. Salem had yet to erect Hanging Hill, so I was carted to a community pasture, allowing the execution to be public yet out of the way of the town center. I was blindfolded, my petticoats bound close to my body, and a noose placed around my neck.
That's what happened to you in those days if you were a little different. I think some of us in the room are in the line. At least from time to time, huh? Thank you. And again, her hanging, she was the first, and though they did 19 more, it was very shocking. People didn't like seeing it, and gradually they began to disbelieve the girls. It just didn't make sense. People were starting to think that it was getting old, and all you had to do was walk down the street, and if you passed by one of them, they'd be like, "You sent your spirit to me last night," and there was nothing a person could do. So that was a sad and dark time in our history, but fortunately we've hopefully moved a little bit away from that. But this leads us to another woman who is kind of different. Rachel Wall's biography is peppered with myths and legends, but if certain tales about her are true, she was one of the first and only American female pirates. As the story goes, Wall was a Pennsylvania native who ran away and married a fisherman named George Wall, but I'm going to let her tell you her story. And some of this, by the way, comes from actual historical records.
We settled in Boston and tried to scrape out a living, but constant money problems eventually led us to a life of crime. In 1781, we procured a small boat teamed with a few low-life mariners, and we began preying on ships off the coast of New England. Our strategy was as ingenious as it was brutal. Whenever a storm passed through the region, we hardy buccaneers would dress the boat to look like it had been ravaged by rough seas. I would then stand on the deck and plead for aid from passing ships. When the unsuspecting rescuers came near, they were promptly boarded, robbed, and murdered. By my count, we robbed 14 ships and killed at least 24 sailors. Yes. My siren song lured many a ship to their doom, but my luck ran out in 1782 when a real storm destroyed our boat and killed George. I had no choice but to continue my thieving. No longer having a ship, I would sneak up on vessels docked in the city and rob the crew while they slept. Sometime in the spring of 1787, not being able to ascertain the exact time, I happened to go on board a ship lying at the Long Wharf in Boston. The captain's name I can't recollect, but I think he was a Frenchman. On my entering the cabin, the door of which had not been fastened, and finding the captain and mate asleep in their beds, I hunted about for plunder and discovered under the captain's head a black silk handkerchief containing upwards of 30 pounds in gold crowns and small change, on which I immediately seized the booty and decamped therewith as quick as possible, which money I spent freely in company as lewd and wicked as myself. Naturally, I didn't confine my creativity to ships, and I racked up several charges for petty theft and larceny. On March 18th, 1789, I was accused of stealing a bonnet, shoes, and buckles from a young girl walking along the road, and I was arrested for highway robbery. The accusation claimed that I saw a lovely bonnet and I simply couldn't resist it, and I attacked 17-year-old Margaret Bender, the young woman wearing the bonnet. During my trial, I denied the theft, claiming I never saw her because I didn't, but I did admit to several acts of piracy. I had already been convicted of 2 counts of robbery. This was the 3rd account, and I was punishable by death. Well, I could not deny my proven past, so in my confession, I listed many petty crimes, carefully avoiding the mention of any that might be a felony. I further admitted to Sabbath breaking, stealing, lying, disobedience to my parents, and almost every other sin a person could commit except murder. I knew I was in trouble, so I tried the tactic that I had been under the influence of my dreadful dead husband, George. Unfortunately, the mea culpa was not enough to sway the authorities, and I was found guilty. Jeez. Attorney General Robert Treat Payne requested that sentence of death might be given against the said Rachel Wall, the prisoner at the bar, and Governor John Hancock signed the order of execution. Yes, that Hancock. One could perhaps speculate that I was being sentenced for crimes far greater than the attempted robbery of a bonnet, tried as a thief, but executed for piracy. I did, however, speak my mind with my last words. Into the hands of the Almighty God, I commit my soul, relying on His mercy, and die an unworthy member of the Presbyterian Church in the 29th year of my age.
Most of those stories are actually hers. The descriptions and the court and all were actually hers. What's interesting was, unfortunately, her crime came at the wrong time. We were a new nation, there was a lot of turmoil, and women traditionally got lesser punishments, but because of of course, we're all equal, right? She got equal treatment with the men.
She did.
She was hung with two others. They were the last people hung for highway robbery. See, you should have waited. You just had to have that act.
I shouldn't have gotten caught.
There you go. There you go. Spoken like a true criminal.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, I think if you do a ghost tour of Boston at night, you will probably meet Rachel Wall. I'm guessing that she's not resting in peace. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you all. So our grand finale is someone we talked about if you were at our meeting last month, and I showed pictures of everyone. Next, we're going to hear about Anne Bailey, who worked as a scout and courier during the Revolutionary War, and she's here to share her incredible story with us. There are many incredible stories about Anne Bailey. It was hard to pick them, so I sort of made a little combo because she was quite a character. So welcome, Anne, also known as Meg. Oh, well, you always wear the spiciest things. Yeah, we should probably stay out of her way, too.
All right. I was born in Liverpool, England, orphaned at 18, and sailed to America with relatives. It was in Virginia that I met and married Richard Trotter, a seasoned frontiersman and experienced soldier. We had one son named William. As more people moved west, fights broke out between the settlers and the Shawnee. The governor of Virginia organized border militia to help calm the area. My husband joined the militia. Called the First Battle of the American Revolution by some, the Battle of Point Pleasant saw the settlers win the battle, but massive casualties on both sides, including my Richard. Upon learning of my husband's death, I left our young son in the care of neighbors and, dressed in the garb of a frontiersman, set out to avenge my loss against the Shawnee. I rode from one recruiting station to another, appealing to all I met to volunteer their service to the militia in order to keep the women and the children in the border safe, to fight for freedom from the Indians and later the British. I will admit I was an unusual sight. Clad in buckskins, leggings, petticoats, heavy brogan shoes, and a man's coat and hat, a hunting knife in my belt around my waist, and a rifle slung over my shoulder, the embodiment of the pioneer spirit of the late 1700s. In one encounter with the Shawnee, I was being chased by them, about to be caught, when I jumped off my horse and hid in a log. In looking everywhere for me, and even sitting on my log, they did not find me. Later that night, I walked into their camp and retrieved my horse. When far enough away, I began to scream and shriek at the top of my voice. The Shawnee thought I was possessed, and therefore could not be injured by a bullet or arrow. From that point on, they feared me, and only watched me from afar, making the woods relatively safe. It was then that I became known to whites and Indians alike as Mad Ann. Several years later, I met and married John Bailey, a member of a legendary group of frontier scouts called the Rangers. John and I, now his now famous gun-toting, hard-riding bride, moved to Fort Henry in the Tennessee frontier. When it became under siege by a large group of Native American warriors allied with the British, we were running low on ammunition and gunpowder. In a desperate move to save the fort, I volunteered to ride to Fort Pitt, located in present-day Pittsburgh, to get a much-needed supply of gunpowder. The mission was risky, as the path between the two forts was through hostile territory. Despite the risk of this incredibly dangerous pass through harsh and unwelcoming country, I mounted my horse and set out on the journey. I made my way through the wilderness, avoiding enemy Native Americans and British patrols, and managed to cross treacherous rivers and dangerous terrain. After reaching Fort Pitt, I secured the needed gunpowder and began the journey back to Fort Henry. I returned with the critical supplies in time, and we were able to hold our ground and repel the siege. When John Bailey died in 1802, I stayed in the wilderness, but eventually went to live with my son and his family in Ohio. My love for writing and for the wilderness had not ceased, and I continued carrying mail and working as an express passenger. I made my last trip to Charleston in 1817 at age 75. Wow. In 1823, I was interviewed by Ann Royal, a local reporter, who asked about my adventure, and bravely I said, I always carried an axe, an auger, and I could chop as well as any man. I trusted in the Almighty, and I knew I could only be killed once, and I had to die sometime.
Thank you so much. Thank you. She was buried in Ohio, and then a DAR chapter in the East dug her and reburied her closer to where she had lived her life. So she's quite extraordinary. Also, another person I had never heard of. So there are so many wonderful stories that we now have, and hopefully will continue to share. Throughout her career, she rode over 1,000 miles carrying letters and recruiting for the military. So she made many rides. This was just one of many. She outran the Native Americans, the British, the Americans, and just about anybody you can imagine. So in conclusion, women obviously in colonial times had traditional women's roles, which are not undifferent from today. But there were a lot of us who said, that's not for me, and went out and made their own way and cleared the path for those of us who follow in their footsteps. And this is another demonstration of the remarkable talent and just the wonderfulness of all of you. Thank you so much. I'd like to recognize and have you come forward if you were a member of our cast. Let's see, we start with Pocahontas. We have Priscilla Alden, Anne Bradstreet, come on, Anne Hutchinson, Mary Dyer, and of course, we'll keep away from Abigail Williams, and pity poor Bridget Bishop, who was probably more like most of us, and the remarkable Rachel Wall, and of course, Anne Bailey. Over this way. Thank you all so much. You are what makes our plays and our chapters so great. And I have a little something.